But it's time now for Uncancelled, where Britain's top commentators speak out on controversial issues without the fear of the cancel culture sweeping the rest of the media. In an age where woke warriors can ruin careers, reputations and lives in the time it takes to send a tweet, hastily written notes, apologies often follow just as fast. The problem with knee-jerk admissions of guilt is that they rarely seem genuine or absolve the person delivering them, and yet our snowflake society has come to expect them for pretty much everything. For example, Boris Johnson is right now under pressure to apologise to mothers who were forced to give their babies up for adoption, a practice that can be dated back to 1945, 19 years before the PM was even born. My guest tonight, associate editor of The Spectator, Rod Liddle, writes in his latest column, The Sorry State of the Modern Apology, that Boris must avoid resorting to virtue signalling and fight back against the tyranny of now, where history is stripped of context and sometimes stripped of all truth. Rod Liddle, great to have you here. The modern apology is becoming meaningless, isn't it?
Yes, and it's been going that way for some time. I identify two kinds of apology. The first is where you've said something which you know people aren't going to like, or which later you discover people don't like, and then you kind of apologise for having caused offence or for people having taken offence at what you said. So you're not actually apologising at all. You're merely saying, I'm really sorry that Tabitha Snowflake was upset by what I said, but it's demanded of you. And it's an important thing to remember if you're ever in this position: never apologise. Never apologise, because that is immediately an admission of guilt. And the woke will not wish to hear your apology. They will merely accept that you are wrong, and they will be all the worse for it. Never apologise. And the second apology, as I've said, is people, usually in positions of power, who apologise for things which happened many, many years before and for which they had no responsibility whatsoever, such as Tony Blair, for example, apologising for slavery. He didn't, so far as I'm aware, own any slaves. And also for apologising, I believe he apologised for the Irish famine back in the 1800s. And I'm pretty sure he didn't eat all of the potatoes. That's again not really an apology. There's no sincerity there. It's basically people simply saying, yes, I'm virtue signalling and the past was bad.
And we actually saw it this week, Rod. I don't know if you've been following the story, but the actor Matt Damon admitted that he had used the F-word gay slur, and that his daughter had pulled him up on it. And actually, the original interview in the Sunday Times was really honest, and Matt Damon was speaking like lots of 50-year-old blokes who didn't realise there was a major problem with the word. And he actually said, look, I'm not going to use it anymore. But rather than just accepting that and accepting that actually it was a good outcome, the woke warriors came for him, of course, and said he should be cancelled. So we've seen this week Matt Damon having to issue a grovelling apology in a statement. It sounds nothing like the genuine bloke who was speaking in the Sunday Times. And I think it's a great example, actually, of exactly, even though you wrote your column before that apology, it's just a great example of what you're talking about.
I think it is, and Matt Damon should simply tell them to piss off, I mean, to put it bluntly, because all of this stuff matters only to a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of us. It's the perpetually active people on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter. I'd probably be sacked within a day if I were on Twitter. But the more I look at Twitter, the more... What?
Your life is much better for not being on Twitter, believe me.
Yes, it is. But it is such a tiny minority of the population, this relentlessly active, largely lefty, although not exclusively. There are plenty of kind of maniacal right-wing nut jobs on Twitter as well, screaming abuse, desperate to be outraged, wetting the bed. And the problem we have, I have no objection to them doing all this. I have no problem really with them trying to whip up a campaign to ensure that Matt Damon is cancelled. The problem comes when the rest of us take it remotely seriously. We shouldn't. We should ignore it.
Yeah, no, indeed. But the problem is you've got the advisors all around these people who are on Twitter and they're completely obsessed with Twitter, and the advertisers are all on Twitter. And so they do now believe that Twitter represents normal life. And I think it's a huge, huge concern, because it's just simply the metropolitan elite, whether it be in Hollywood or New York or London, who are obsessed with this vile platform.
Yeah, it's the Emily Maitlis syndrome. Emily is repeatedly biased in her interviews, but she has this coterie of Twitter followers who probably all of them live in Kensal Rise or Queen's Park, and all of them confirm her biases. It's confirmation bias. Twitter is the greatest example we have of confirmation bias. And there's a brilliant thing I remember at the last election when the Conservatives unexpectedly took a seat in County Durham, which they had no right to take, a solid Labour seat. And one of the campaigners for the Labour Party, shocked at this result, said, "I don't understand it. Our candidate was on Twitter all the time. The Conservative didn't go on Twitter at all." As if, and she wasn't being ironic, this lunatic. She was, her assumption was that the election must be fixed or rigged somehow because Twitter showed her that a majority of people supported her candidate, which is obviously, it's a delusional apparatus, Twitter.
Rod, I've got my superstar panel with me tonight, the comedian and writer Abby Roberts, the conservationist and former MEP Stanley Johnson, and our GBNews presenter and head of digital, Becca Hudson. So, Becca, I'm going to come to you first on this, because I imagine, Becca, you like an apology. You think an apology is a good thing. So take on Rod and explain why.
I wonder if there is some symbolism in apologising. So, of course, Boris Johnson is not responsible for the way that these young women were treated before he was born, or was Tony Blair single-handedly responsible for slavery. But does it not represent the progress that we have made? And you even say yourself, the past is another country and we've moved on, and it's about acknowledging that things weren't done well in this other country, and we acknowledge that and the impact it's had and the consequences it's had, and it's our way of drawing the line between what happened then and what happened now. Is there not some? It feels performative, but actually what it represents could be quite symbolic and quite meaningful.
No, I think my problem is that it is performative. And it would be okay were there context involved in it. Now, particularly on the issue of my piece actually was about women having their children taken away from them, single parents having their children taken away from them between 45 and 75. There is a good argument to be had, which would be that Boris Johnson would be better off apologising to the children who've been brought up in single families ever since 1945, and as a consequence have been more likely to be impoverished, more likely to do badly at school, more likely to have mental health problems, more likely to be involved in crime, more likely to resort to drug use. All of those things are unquestionably, a facet of being brought up in a single family. So what you do when you make these apologies is you lose historical context. And the historical context at the time, and I think we were probably right in the 60s and 70s, was to care about the child more than we cared about the mum. And these days we care about the mum more than we care about the child. And that's a change, a shift in what we think is right. But on balance, what I mean is when we give these apologies, you need to have historical context.
I mean, I don't know whether I think we probably would disagree on the value of single parent families. I think there are lots of single mothers and single fathers who do incredible jobs raising their kids. And these women that we're talking about were never given the chance, were they? So a judgment was made about the standard of parenting these kids were made before anyone had any chance to demonstrate what they could do. So it is heinously and grossly unfair what happened.
But again, that's not quite right. You say they were never given a chance. In many cases, they were given a chance. And it wasn't simply that a judgment was made. It was the judgment that time of society. And pretty much everybody that those unfortunate women came into contact with. So it would be their own parents, for example, it would be the midwives, it would be the nurses, it would be the social workers, it would be the doctors. All would come to that conclusion. It's not as if some judge laid down the law and said, take that child away. That was the general view of society. And if you make that apology, you then have to deal with that context. And as to the question, I'm not blaming the single parents for the way they bring up the kids. They do an incredible job. The problem is that whether you like it or not, and whether I like it or not, children who are brought up in single family households are prone to all those things I suggested before, far, far more than they are if they're brought up in a double family household, a double parent household. It's just inescapable, you know.
Stanley Johnson, where do you stand on this one?
Well, I read Rod with great pleasure, but I also say that a little goes a long way. That is my line on this one, and I think you're basically wrong on this one, Rod, when you say never apologise. That cannot be so. I lived in Brussels for years. I used to go to the Museum of African History. In that museum, you can see old photographs of mounds and mounds of right hands. Just right hands. I'm talking mounds as high as this ceiling. And what are those hands of? They're of African workers whose right hands were cut off because they hadn't picked enough rubber in the forests of the Congo. Okay, you may say that's 180 years ago, 200 years ago. Nonetheless, there is, I think, a great symbolic impact of saying, gosh, we got it wrong. And I don't think the Belgian government, who, of course, it wasn't the Belgian government, it was King Leopold in person who owned the Congo.
Well, that's the point, Stanley. That's the point, mate. That's the point. It's not the Belgian government.
But the Belgian government can do it, Rod. The Belgian government can do it.
Do you think, perhaps, that the Ottoman Empire should apologise right now for the transgressions which took place against Christians, against Jews?
Well, you talk about the Ottoman Empire. I can tell you something. My grandfather was assassinated partly because he protested. He was Minister of the Interior, partly because he had protested about the treatment of the Armenians after the First World War.
Well, I would join him in doing that. I would join him in doing that, and I think there is a very good case to say that we should hammer Turkey and indeed Azerbaijan for its treatment of Armenia. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. But what I'm saying is that it's going back so far, 180 years in the case which you cite, Stanley, that it doesn't really make any difference. It doesn't really make any... that apology doesn't have any resonance.
It might make a huge difference to the people living in the Congo today.
I don't think it does. To make an apology, you have to sincerely feel your own guilt. You know, that is what it would come to. That's what an apology means, that you sincerely feel your own guilt.
Well, I want to tell you, Rod, that there are rich Belgian families whose wealth has come from the Congo, and they still enjoy it, and I don't think it would do them any harm to join in an apology.
Yeah, well, we differ.
Okay, Abby Roberts, where do you stand on this?
Hi, Rod. I really feel like a cigarette now watching you. You know what's interesting? I think I don't know what you think about this, Rod, but I think the increasing changes of meaning in language means that what we thought of as an apology however many years ago, before the woke agendas took over, I mean, take apology, racism, sexism, any phobia, the meaning of things has been so diluted that actually, why isn't somebody, for instance, saying, Mr. Blair, where's the apology for the Iraq war and killing all those Iraqis? Surely that's more relevant, but they choose their sacred cows, don't they? They choose slavery, and because it's a sort of it's an agenda. It comes under the woke umbrella. Those topics.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And yes, I would be very grateful if both Tony Blair and indeed Alistair Campbell apologised for the Iraq War, which was something which stopped me in my tracks from ever voting Labour again. Simply couldn't do it. I actually voted Green in 2005, for goodness sake. I don't know what came over me.
Whoa, what were you
Don't
thinking?
start Stanley on the Green agenda.
Rod Liddle, the segment's
I
called
think it was
Uncancelled, so I'm not going to
mushrooms.
cancel you for that. Don't worry, but what a revelation. Rod
But
Liddle,
no, I agree entirely that the words become devalued. And that there are so many words that become devalued as well. And it is particularly so as a consequence of the compression of words on Twitter. You have 20 words to express yourself, and you cannot possibly get any context. Owen Jones is forever retweeting things which I wrote 5 years ago or 2 years ago or 20 years ago, and saying, look what he said, when actually, if you read the whole piece, I mean exactly the opposite of what Owen is suggesting I mean. But that's because Owen has the IQ of a block of David Stowe cheddar cheese. But that goes out to millions of people, and they think, oh, Liddle is a racist, paedophile Islamophobe. That must be true. And there is no way to.
Is lost.
That's full house in woke bingo, isn't it?
Rod Liddle, thank you very much. We will speak again next week. Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.